All right, we're here. Second to last presentation of the Social Sciences Week related to the outdoor therapy stuff. I will send out a PDF with a bunch of different opportunities to engage with this community for probably like the rest of the year. It's got some links. We were just having a ramble about outdoor therapies. You have a 20% off code to get that book that I did with Nevin. If you'd like to. And there's a bunch of other stuff, like if you're going to if you're in Darwin or want to go to Darwin, you got some trainings with future Dr. Pringle, who's joining us today. This is a topic that when we think of human rights is something that kind of came to, I was always interested in questioning things and was always pretty oppositional about some things. But I knew I always wanted to work in wilderness therapy and be in the woods. And being out there for long term, as long as I could. I grew up going to summer camp 8 weeks a year, where we did a 2 or 3 night overnight expedition every once a week. So whether I was canoeing or backpacking, that's just how I grew up from about 8 years old. So I loved the idea of being out in the woods a long time with young people. And while making no money and being away from home over half the year, there was a social worker I was working with who said, you've got to go to school. You've got to go get a degree. You can't make McDonald's wages for this long. And that said, what I was getting paid to live in Tucker County, West Virginia, was pretty good money because you don't have to buy anything there. There's nothing to do. So I went back home to Maryland and Washington, like just living right outside of Washington, D.C. I took some community college classes, and I managed to transfer to a new campus for University of Maryland, Baltimore County, which was, it was actually the first they call it a green building, first green campus, I believe in the United States, but definitely in Maryland. And so we had all the roofs of the building were all covered in gardens, and we could go outside and work with the chefs and things. It was a beautiful new small campus in Gaithersburg, Maryland, so not in Baltimore. And so when it came time for me to do a placement, I had a meeting with the internship coordinator, and she said to me, well, what do you have in mind? And I said, well, pick any wilderness therapy program in the country. I'll just go there and I'll learn some more things. And she said, no, I think you should do something different and gain some different experience. And I was really annoyed by this because I knew I shouldn't do any other experience. I knew what I would do the rest of my life. And so she sent me to this, think like a strip mall, like outlets, in between a 7-Eleven and a thrift store, with CBH Life Skills, this dingy building in a kind of factory area sort of part of town. And it was a day clinic for adults with severe and persistent mental illness. And so they gave me a bunch of groups to run. I managed to implement some outdoor stuff, which was really fun. But I started asking some questions like, where do these clients come from? Well, we picked them up every day in a big white crappy van with a cracked windshield. We picked them up every day from these set of townhouses that are funded by the state for them to have supervised living. Then they come to our program where social work students fill out case notes that they send to Medicaid to get more state funding. And then one day I get a phone call, hey, your client Steve won't be coming in today. He's taking part in a clinical trial for a new antipsychotic around schizophrenia. I said, okay, makes sense, I guess. And then a few weeks later, another client, there's a phone call. Yeah, it's so-and-so from the hospital. This client, Marianne, she's not going to be coming in today. She's taking part in another clinical trial at the hospital. Guess who owned the supervised living facility? And guess who owned the day clinic that we worked at? That pharmaceutical research company. So they were getting millions of dollars from National Institute of Mental Health in the United States to run clinical trials for antipsychotics. And so for me, what I realized is nothing we're doing is about helping people get well again. Everything was about keeping the participants engaged. So when a new clinical trial came around, we had the rats for them to do their testing on. And it was one of those things, once I saw it, I could not see it. And I started talking about it in school. And when we had our supervision meetings about our placement, and it was really, really shocking to me. And these were people that they were sick. Like there was a lot of problems going on. But if we do take the lens of complex trauma in as a predictor of mental health or mental illnesses, and I'm using that word cautiously to not sound like a doctor, then what we were doing to treat these people was really the most contraindicated form of this, just using them as guinea pigs. And so it made me start kind of a career of questioning things through the lens of human rights and through the lens of how we think about this work. And I'm glad to have Nevin here, because and you don't have to say anything, Nevin, if you don't want to. Of course, you have your own free will. But Nevin and I have both seen, in the name of adventure therapy, things that are quite similar of violating people's human rights. And I didn't think of the language of human rights. I thought of everything as a social worker, and the lens that we use to have preserve people's self-determination, be trustworthy, preserve people's agency and their autonomy and their right to choose and their right to experience things. And then I've seen nature used as a way to hold people, as a punishment for people, as a way to break people down to build them up. And so that is kind of the opposite of my experience in nature growing up, which was used just to have fun, build relationship, maybe some youth development, and things like that. So that started a long journey. And then I was grateful to meet my good friend, Grham Pringle, who was sort of another person that saw an elephant in the room that needed to be questioned. And so I'm going to pass over to Grham to talk a bit about these basic human rights things, because this can be a bit of a downer, but I think that's really important. And with the recordings, we are putting these up on YouTube, which is really great. I mean, Unda's presentation, I know this is small numbers on YouTube wise, but she had 10 views of her presentation in less than an hour, which was pretty great. I haven't checked since, but my friend Daniel, who I do the Adventure Therapy podcast with, he called me this week and said, please put the recordings up on YouTube, because if you type in adventure therapy on YouTube, the only thing we get is mostly people saying, I'm a survivor of a certain form of practice. And that's the dominant social media narrative of outdoor therapies. And taking human rights seriously is probably a way that we can start to change that narrative and bring safer practices in the name of this field that many of us love. So I'm going to shut up, and over to you, Grham.
Good morning, everybody. And I'm coming to you from Yagara country, or the Aboriginal nation of the land that I'm living on. And in the background is actually Jinnaburra country, which is further up the road, but it's sort of special to me. It's where I proposed to my wife on top of one of those hills. Will and I haven't got a really good script for this. We're sort of going to respond to each other and to questions. But just to follow on from what Will was saying, why did I get into the human rights field? It came because the more I looked at complex trauma, which is really where my research and practice goes, the more I realized that the DSM version of complex trauma, or CPTSD, which it doesn't even have, but its understanding of trauma and how it's all PTSD, that doesn't really match with what the leading clinicians understand to be complex trauma. Complex trauma doesn't require those life threat incidents that PTSD and CPTSD need. Complex trauma is more, can be that, but it's more the grinding microaggressions on a day-to-day basis where a young person is unable to form a sense of who they are, their sense of self, and lives in constantly in a sense of threat. That might be at home, it might be at school, church, wherever, or it might just be in society, particularly from a racial point of view. So the complex trauma is about a person's autonomy being denied to them. They're unable to form that sense of who they are, that what we describe as a sense of self, which really comes back to they're denied their human rights. And so a human rights-based approach to working with such people is the opposite of the experience of being complexly harmed, which is what we're working against. So when I see adventure practices that would appear to not adhere to human rights, it kind of feels to me that these practices are working in the opposite direction to the way I am. We're actually in conflict, not directly, but it feels to me like the work that I'm doing and how I'm trying to help people to improve their practices being undone by this other way of doing things. All these other ways of doing things, because it's really quite easy to slip into, I think, a human rights reducing practice without knowing about it, without understanding. And Will's got his own story about how he came to see sort of some of the practices that he was raised in back in the States, and how it wasn't until he managed to get out of those practices and look back in that he understood more from a different dimension what was going on. What I'll do with now would just be to take you to a small presentation on human rights that I use often, and it's just the main human rights that apply to the practice that I'm involved in, which is young people with complex trauma or complex histories. And it comes from two different human rights conventions. So the United Nations started with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then progressively over time, they've added quite a number, and they look at different populations. And these human rights declarations have been considered from an intercultural perspective, and quite contentious at times. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights didn't suit some cultures, and as with everything at the United Nations, I imagine there's quite a lot of negotiation between cultural settings, religions, different political systems, as people came to some agreement at the United Nations about what a universal set of rights for a particular group of the population group would look like. So they're quite robust and largely acceptable between cultures, although there are some bits that may be considered more Western and not as comfortable for people from Eastern religions, for instance. The two human rights declarations that are important to my work, or two of them, are the rights of the child and the rights of people with disabilities. Now, just a word on that, the rights of people with disabilities includes mental health. The United Nations and the World Health Organizations considers disability to be mental health to be a disability. So we won't argue with that at the moment, because we're really looking at the rights and how that helps people rather than how people are named and categorized, etc., which I also have some questions about. So I'm going to take you through a short presentation looking at 7 specific articles from within these 2 different human rights conventions, each one of which has about 30 articles in it. So there's quite a lot to look at, but these are the 7 standouts to me. So I'm just going to share this with you. We can all see that, can we, Will?
Yeah, it looks great. Thank you.
Cool. So the first article is the rights of the child. So up in the top there, it describes which of the conventions we're looking at. And the rights of the child include the right to having information. So that means factual information as good as they can understand it, and treating even very young children as being able to understand and what's happening to them and for them and what their options are. So factual, timely, fullest information that can possibly be understood by the young person about their circumstances so that they can have some agency. And there are some programs that deny information about what's happening at the end of the day. Like, where are we going today? Oh, you'll find out when we get there. Just be in the moment. I understand the intention to stay in the moment. That would seem good, but it's a denial of information, which is pretty important to someone. Like, where are we going? And what's going to be there when I get there? So I think it's important we're able to answer those questions. The second one that stood out was the rights of the child include that they have a right to voice. And this is particularly about the things that are happening to them. As a foster carer, it was really obvious that a lot of young people didn't have much voice in what happened to them. Those decisions were made by adults in their interest, but their sense of agency was considerably impinged by the fact that no one actually asked them what they needed and what their view on what was happening to them was. And that, in terms of a sense of self, has to be a fundamental thing that they need. So the third one being the right to opportunities. Initially, this looks like people from different cultures also having the ability to attend education, to have access to resources, etc. Yes, but looking at this from an ecological dynamics perspective, which we don't really have time, it's not really the topic for today, but ecological dynamics is based on the idea that instead of being prescriptive and telling people what they need to do, that we're offering invitations for people to engage in something that is health promoting. So, and more than one invitation, would you like to do this or this? Which of those 2 or 3 or 4 things do you think would be most useful for you today? Sometimes that's difficult to do in adventure therapy because there might be one track through a rainforest. You really don't have many options apart from go forward, go back, or stay on the track. But so they are not always that we can give people a wide range of choices, but we should always have more than one choice. And people should have a real ability to make that choice and for it to be delivered and not just a tokenistic thing. Again, that means that they can decide for themselves what's happening to them. The next one that was important to me, I thought, again, within the rights of the child, and this is the last of the rights of the child that we'll look at in this presentation, is the right to protection. So as adults looking after young people and having them in our care, we have obligations to protect them from harm, to protect them from neglect, and to enhance their circumstances, and make sure that others are not doing that. So one of the things I teach in the training that I run, the 2-day training, is the idea of fierce dignity, or the professional ensuring that they're advocating fiercely sometimes for the young person they're providing care to, because systems often treat people in an undignified way, and that's particularly the case with young people when they don't have voice and agency, etc. Moving into the rights of people with disabilities, I love the fact that they've got dignity as one of the articles within the convention. And dignity is not just respect. Dignity is that everything effectively on the planet has dignity, it has purpose, it has value because it exists. And that goes for people as well. We all have value, we all have our own strengths and things that we're losing the words here. It's just that inherent value. So everybody and everything should have value. Should have dignity. All we can do is enhance that dignity or diminish it. There's no nuance between the two. You're either adding to or you're withdrawing from that sense of dignity. So I think that's a really useful way of us thinking about the people we serve. The second in the disability articles that I thought was useful was the notion that they need choice. They should be given the ability to determine for themselves exactly what will happen next, and be free from coercion, because coercion is quite often what is happening when people are being neglected, abused, or overly strictly parented or managed, or there's a boundaryless experience of growing up. So they're both coercive to a fair degree. So coercion is one of the things that's particularly important, and choice means that we're not coercing, is effectively the binary opposite. The last we'll look at in this little presentation is the right to being regarded as competent. That's a fairly clear thing when you're talking about people with intellectual disabilities, for instance, that many times people make decisions for them, thinking they can't do that for themselves. But they have a right to make decisions and show that they've got skills of their own wherever possible. And that should be encouraged so that they, again, have that sense of agency. They're able to do things for themselves. And I think that's exactly the same for young people. We often think that they are just not competent, not capable of doing things. And young people are often spectacularly capable. And when they've come from really complex histories, they've often got strengths that most of us adults don't have. They don't always manifest nicely, but they're often really strong in protecting themselves and other people. And that's something that can be harnessed in a good direction. So that's the end of that presentation. Will, any comments on that?
Well, I think we weren't going to talk about dignity of risk, but I think it is an important segue as you got to those rights of the people with disability. And we talked about it briefly in Margaret's presentation, but there's an idea sometimes that we can fall into the trap of overprotection of people, and then that limits people's right to choose and people's ability to make decisions about what they want for themselves. And sometimes people have better things to do than come to therapy. and so we can over importantize, that's not even a word, Will, make overly important our therapy, and in the name of keeping people safe. And so yeah, I mean, I think that's why Charlene's presentation was so cool, that we have these young people who were removed from home in the name of keeping them safe. And I know I've been to my fair share of residential facilities in Adelaide, and they're all kind of a shithole. And then why not, if we're spending all this money, give people cool experiences as an alternative to just putting people in a group home or in a dodgy facility. We had the Cooper's Brewery, for context, that's like South Australia's biggest brewery. It's down in the industrial side of town. One of the residential facilities I was taking some of the young people on an expedition, and it was like right in the brewery, just this little home, like almost like if you had a big square of the brewery's land, and then it was like then a little out of it, just where this, so it was like in a factory. It was like the worst setting, I would think, to be conducive of growing up. And this, it was a really horrible place with security, buzz yourself in, the staff behind mirrors, and it was just looked like a jail. So thank you for that, Grant, because I think it reminds me of things that I could always do to be better at these things in my own practice. And I wonder if anyone who's here, since we do have a nice intimate group, if someone would like to add a reflection or something that came up while Graham was going through that. Is that okay with you, Graham? Yep.
Yep. Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
I'll volunteer.
Claire?
I work in an outdoor kindergarten, so it's only a small group of children. I also work in a normal kindergarten with higher needs, so I support the higher needs children. And I've often, I'm very new to this whole conversation, so yeah, not familiar with any of these ideas, I suppose, or haven't thought about them. Yeah, so I just was reflecting that I often wonder how we would take some of the kids I look after in the normal, the indoor, normal kindergarten, how we would manage those outside, the risk to other children, the risk to themselves. And it's not really something we need to go into, but that was my reflection. Like, how do we offer, I guess that's what attracted me to this today. How do we even start figuring out how to do, you probably have this experience, but that's why I'm here, to sort of start thinking about that. Yeah.
Claire, I might give a quick response to that. And that's a very real concern. What I think needs to happen is returning to the human right of having choice, and the deep ecology, the ecological dynamics idea of affordances or invitations to participate in healthy ways, is that we've got to look at the practice we've got and figure out how to vary it, so that there are opportunities for each of the individuals within what we're doing. And that sometimes means that we've got to change the style of the things that we do, so that can be more available. So, for instance, and I think Will's on with me here, some young people would not find going outdoors with a group of other young people very health promoting. They'd find it really quite stressful. And to do that would probably be a silly thing. If that was what we made them do, would probably be silly. So in my practice, certainly I see a lot of the young people we work with, they do a one-to-one intervention because that's what they function best with. And groups are really problematic for them.
Right.
So we might be able to work with them for a while as one individuals and then get them there, but that might be outside the scope of your practice. So now you've got a problem of how could I possibly provide that? There is no answer, but I just encourage you to look at, rather than one thing that we're going to offer them, how can we offer a number of things within the context of the bounds of my practice?
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Will, what are we doing next?
Good answer, Graham. Well, let's look at some one of the things in your when I did my PhD research, I didn't go after bad practices. Really, what I was hoping to do was look at client experiences and see what did work and what can we do more of that works. It was really kind of a really basic idea. And unfortunately, what I found during my interviews is a lot of people saying they hate outdoor therapies and wilderness therapy in particular. And we're not going to get into the specifics because it's distracting and it can be confusing when none of us work in that sector. So none of us do that type of stuff. But I think there are lessons there. I did an episode of the Very Bad Therapy podcast talking about this, and what Ben Feynman says at the end of it, he said, when you look at really bad therapy practice, like things that we'd all go, oh my gosh, this is egregious, it's really just an archetype for the little things we all can do, all the little stuff, all the little traps that we can get into, and viewing if whether it's for instance, Graham said something that I do most of my work with groups. I feel very comfortable in groups and very comfortable facilitating groups. At the same time, there's a risk of treating every member of that group the same. Everyone's going abseiling today. Everyone's getting this dinner. Everyone has to wake up at this time. And so part of that is just normal group facilitation. At the same time, part of that is also it also can get into sort of a trap. And we saw one of the things in doing this work, Graham and I, well, Graham went about this a little bit of a different way, which was really interesting. But I interviewed a bunch of people who had been on programs and put this all out there. How'd they wind up in therapy in the first place? What we learned from their previous experiences of therapy, what made them get outside, what worked, what were their therapeutic relationships like. And one of the things we kind of glossed over with complex trauma is inherently relational. And that means what we do is relational in kind of working with that. And the way Graham did it, which is sort of different is going to social media and combing what young people are saying they experienced. So Graham, you want to go over to you to talk about this for a few minutes, and then I think we just open it up and have a dialogue.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what I did is I went to, so what was happening is I was seeing in Facebook largely young people who describe themselves as survivors of types of adventure therapy and residential treatment. And they'd talk about things. I remember once somebody put up a slide of a white chair, and they were all making jokes about the white chair. And then they showed different types of white chairs, and you could see it was really meaningful to them, and not in a good way. Like it was this, the white plastic chair represented something pretty horrible. I had no idea what they were referring to. There's clearly something going on that was beyond my ken. So I started asking some questions about things, and I ended up going, and also I was looking at the academic literature, and even managed to get some field books and program descriptions and things. It's just a lot of this, the things that they're referring to are not mentioned. It's just absent. So I couldn't understand what they were talking about. What were these things that were upsetting them? I didn't have a clue. I went to Reddit, to a survivors group of the troubled teen industry. So a wide range of programs happening in America, largely. And I got permission to ask some questions, and I asked specifically about practices involving adventure. I wasn't really interested in the residential treatment stuff because that's not where my research is based. And I asked for examples of practice or things that happened to young people who were on these programs since 2014. So it was fairly specific. This is not ancient history. This is within the lifestyle, the lifespan of a very young person. And when they answered, I produced a list out of their answers of things. And I'm just going to share with you a slide of a quarter of the things that I've listed. And it might be of interest. I hope it's just check. Will, can you read that? Is that clear?
Yeah, it's clear enough, I guess.
Okay. So these are, and this is a slide I presented at the International Conference in Norway in June. An example of impinging upon people's dignity. So I also looked at involuntary treatment, neglect, and mind control. But these are some of the things they're talking about. I'm going to go from the bottom because people are probably reading from the top. But a weekly inspection of skin infections, because they don't have access to a whole lot of hygiene ability. They call it a butt inspection. So effectively, staff are going around making people reveal their bodies and doing this check just as a routine. I mean, I did that when I was in the army. It's a little bit odd. Then there's some things that people aren't allowed to have, like they're not allowed to have toothpaste. Like that's a pretty dangerous thing to have. Not allowed to have toothpaste. You got to go and ask for toothpaste. How dignified is it to go and ask for toothpaste? It's not a major thing. And most of the time they're not allowed to have torches. Why? Because a torch might mean that they could run away from the program. So, you know, there's layers of you can see why if they remove the torch so that someone can't run away, but you've got to ask, like, how dignified is it to use nature and darkness as a way of keeping someone there who doesn't want to be there, and so not providing a torch. I understand there's a program that provides, you know, trying to meet this. You know, it's obviously an undignified thing, and particularly if, you know, to be in the dark, and dark represents for a lot of our young people some pretty horrendous experiences. So rather than give them a torch because they might run away, they give them a glow stick so they can just see enough to see around them, but they're still going to trip over things if they run away. It's just not dignified. And these things compound upon each other. So that's just a list of some of the things that are. Is there any questions about some of the things that are on that list from anyone?
We are using this. We have used, and we have been critiqued by this, which I think is a fair critique, that and we have Ben here, who works at I have run some trips with Operation Flinders here, and I've worked for Operation Flinders, and there are definitely stories from the past of people doing what we'd all consider as undignified approaches. And that's an organization that's an example of coming a really long way as well. Ben, do you want to add something about that? I see you unmuted.
Yeah. Thanks, Will. Yeah, I think for me, like, Graham, reading that list, for me, what sort of stands out more than anything is that it seems like obviously those that have been entrusted with the duty of care of those young people have clearly just not got the skills, confidence, or ability to do their work. If like, to me, reading through that whole list shows just an incompetence of those, I guess, that are in charge, or have from that position of responsibility, and their way of trying to maintain control or command is as you say, to remove the dignity of people. And I think one of my big reflections, I think, in recent times, and obviously shared on social media, and we had the chance to learn from you earlier this year, but my mentality probably came more so from, I think, more out of caution for young people. That so I can hand on heart say that I haven't done anything on that list, but I think just in terms of respecting the rights of young people, like, I think it can also be looked at from the other way, in that we do our best to try and counteract what we know the past has been, and so we're trying to protect, or we're trying to make sure that we don't create those same issues, but we're still not honouring that right. And so I think for me, my big reflection has been that adventure therapy, or outdoor learning, or whatever we choose to refer to it as, we're needing to put more of an emphasis on that. This is a much needed and a critical part of, I think, a young person's development, many young people's development, and that, to Will's point, from an Not Flinders perspective, I would say that there's a lot of things that I think people sort of see the outdoors as kind of, they kind of categorize it as just this fun thing, and so how can you possibly spend all this time on it, because all you're just doing is having fun, or you've got to give it the time and the space, not just in terms of the experience in the field, but the time and the space, I think, in terms of preparing young people and getting them ready for that, and enabling them with a sense of agency and empowerment to make the most of that experience. And I think that's probably been the big learning for me this year, is that taking that time, so for our recent Not Flinders experience, we actually took 12 weeks to work with our young people, and we did everything, everything from showing them the kind of food that they were going to eat, to sitting down with the map in front of them and talking them through where the intentions are that we were going to go. And I can safely say that that did nothing to encourage them to run away, or gave them no sort of motivation to think that they could escape the property or anything like that. What it actually did is it just empowered them to feel like they could be part of they were in control of their own experience. And I think that was certainly after the last exercise, like, to sort of self-boast for a little bit, but I think that gave a lot of other sort of, I guess, the team leaders some comfort, and hopefully some inspiration that they don't have to worry, they don't have to fear, they don't like, there is actually a really beautiful opportunity in that for young people to really grab that experience with both hands and make something of it. And certainly, well, I'd agree, like, organizations like Not Flinders have come a long way, and for me personally, like, from I guess a personal satisfaction point of view, that this has certainly been the most satisfying experience that I've had with Not Flinders. And because you're able to be, I'd like to think what often we are, is just someone that stands in the background and just facilitates an experience where young people are in control, and that they feel like that they're undertaking their own transformation, and that they're able to recognize and reflect on their own growth and all of those sorts of things.
Thanks for that, Ben.
Can I just make I think Ben's right to a degree in terms of the skills. There are some people out there may not have great set of skills, and so they use coercive ways to limit what's going on so that they can do what they know to do. But I think there's also another fear, a fear of losing control of the process. And I think what Ben was talking about there to an extent was what it felt like to give full information and the ability to choose and those sorts of things. So when we operate in this human rights based way, we do lose that sense of control. And it can be to feel comfortable with not knowing exactly what will happen next. That's actually quite a thing. On my experience, largely though, young people respond to that really well because we're treating them with dignity, and the decisions they make usually are good. But sometimes we also means that we have to stop what's going on because we've got to address how the decision making is going and how their individual decisions are affecting everybody else. But that's life. That's I think part of what we're actually trying to teach them is how to get along in a group. And so we don't do that by not allowing them the dignity or risk of socially upsetting up other people. So I think that's actually grist for the mill. So there's a skills component for sure for some. I think there's also a fear of not being in control of the process because what will happen if it goes badly. By the way, when they do research on locked facilities, like locked mental health wards with lots of coercion, people being in solitary confinement, being restrained by mechanical restraints and chemical restraints, what they find when they train the staff and they move to a non-coercive and unlocked facility, that the level of the incidence of violence both reduce in number and reduce in severity. So it's actually the opposite of what people are fearing. They're fearing this dangerous explosion when we take off the controls. When you do it with a bit of training and process, it actually goes the other way. The third thing I think that can involve this is extra to what Ben's talking about, I think, is that for some people there's a belief here and they're operating in a paradigm which doesn't allow them to see other opportunities and other ways of doing it. And so it's just not there. They cannot conceive of this. And when you do your basic psychology training, they talk about, white swans and black swans and things like this. If you've never actually seen a black swan, you think all swans are white. So and then when you see a white swan, you go, oh, okay, now there's a totally different way of understanding what swans look like, because now I know that there's two colors. So I think there's a bit of that. There's a belief that people get entrenched in, very difficult for them to understand how to do things differently. And I don't know if you want me to put up that slide I had before of conflicting deliveries, Will, or if that's not really relevant to this point.
No, I think we can just keep going with this, because I think this is also a really important point about going outdoors, that we most of us have we're grounded in this experiential learning and the idea that people that we work with, whether it's kindergartners or adults, can have a meaningful experience outdoors. The more we control that experience, the less opportunity we're really dictating the meaning we want that person to take away. So in the Outdoor Therapies book, Martin Ringer and Luke Peters, two therapy people that believe some wacky kind of stuff, but they're really cool people. And I would say that to their face, so I'm not gossiping here, but they talk about how, think about when we go to a ropes course and we say, hey, let's do a trust fall. Well, we've told the people what they're supposed to learn. You're supposed to learn trust. Instead of going, let's do this experience, what happened for you? And then the person is, and so even the word adventure is some sort of journey with an uncertain ending. We don't know where we're going. We don't know what the outcome will be. And so I think we often have to embrace that unknowing and be inherently relational. And I'll open it back up in a sec to someone else who might have something to say. But when we think of, this is sort of, in counseling theories, we think of, as Nevin has put here, program versus experiences. And the word program is really problematic too, isn't it? I'm going to program you to, you're going to be programmed. And in counseling theory, we used to talk about resistance. Well, people still do. And resistance was, it's a medical term, like their cancer is treatment resistant, right? there's something about this character that's resisting the treatment I'm providing. And they did this study, which I can't find anymore. So you're going to have to bear with, I'm going to do the bullshitty academic thing where I tell you about a study and I'm only going to be 80% correct in what I say. So they got these therapists in an interaction, sitting, normal talk therapy, sitting across from somebody. And one of the things they did is the therapist was trained, like at one point in the session, to stop following the client's lead and ask quite judgmental questions. This is going to seem really basic. Why do you think you're doing so much substance use? Don't you know the impact this is having on your family? And the clients, even though they were engaged for the first 30 minutes of that session, that 10 minutes of judgment, people shut down. Clients sat further back in their chair, and just with the language and the questions that they used. And what the way the researchers wrote it was, resistance in counseling is actually all relational. So when a client is disengaged, it's actually on us. So in the outdoors, when people are acting out or being naughty, it's not the character, it's something we need to sit down and talk with that person and figure it out. And the example I've written about previously, the first time I met an Aboriginal person was getting a group of 10 young women from the APY lands. Talk about being so out of my depth. I had no idea what I was doing. And that basically it was 3 sleepless nights while I did a facilitated culturally inappropriate program. And this was with Operation Flinders, their first all Indigenous group they ever run. I just had no idea what I was doing. And thankfully, they had 2 school teachers from their community that basically did everything for the first few days while I figured out, why do these kids keep acting out when I want them all to learn to set up their own shelter? Well, they all sleep in one house at home. So I was doing something totally ridiculous. And so, yeah, back over to you, Graham, you have something you want to add?
You can see my panic when I haven't got unmuted myself. There would be a concern. There was certainly a concern from me, and I think I'm hearing a little bit, or potentially from other people, when we release the reins, when we have that uncertainty of what will happen next, and we have some of those resistance type things that you were just that we can see happen, where young people who sometimes that release of reins can actually cause some behavior it's dangerous. It can be manipulative with other people. It can just become feral. The group starts to become a very unsafe place. Remember, young people have the right to protection, and it's our duty to ensure that they have that. So if you've got a group that you've released the reins on, you're giving choice and control and agency to them, and some of the decisions that they're making are making others feel unsafe and are potentially harmful, you need to stop that process. And you may have to disband the group. You may have to separate warring factions out and deal with all that. And if you can't get it back on track and make a safe group, then you're doing harm. So they have a right to protection. We then have to make some really hard decisions about what we do next, or whether we continue at all. So it's not as if we just hand over the reins and if it explodes, that's just what happens. We have to still maintain a professional boundary around what's healthy and what's unhealthy in the experience that develops from our giving those choices. So had something else I was going to mention. Will, what was it? Are we close to wrapping up, Will? Because I did want to finish by showing the website and how I'm encouraging organisations to declare their human rights. Is it appropriate to do that?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Hasn't prepared that very well. Hang on. Sorry,
I think also one of the things that what Nevin wrote about client fit is I'm interested in how we think about the words that we use. Like in the past 30 years, we've all become infatuated with trauma, and programs that we know are doing questionable practices, all they've done is place trauma informed in front of what they've already done, and then nothing changes. And so if trauma informed practices are in trying to do the enhancing of dignity, we have to question what the words really mean when we say them. Are we just pasting them on for marketing purposes? And so that is one thing I think in the research that I've done, both with Nevin and what we've written with Grham and some others, has always been about, if we have people who are saying this program, I mean, I was at a 10 years ago, however long ago, and I was still working at Operation Flinders. I was wearing the shirt and I was at a bar, and I basically got cussed out by the bartender saying, why would you endorse this organization? I went there 15 years ago. It was the worst experience of my life. So bad practices happen everywhere, but we want to make sure that, and this is not the crap on Operation Flinders, they've done a lot of amazing work. And so one of the things, one of the things we think about is, you know, if these people that are calling themselves survivors looked at our practices, would they go, even though I had a shit experience, that sounds like a pretty dignified way to approach this work? And I think that is sort of the stance that I take, is there is bad practice, and I want to be really clear that I'm not lumped in with that. Now, Graham, before we hop over to you, Nevin has a story to share.
I didn't mean to send that. Well, I was trying to erase it because I know you're running out of time. You're wrapping up right now at the top of the hour?
Well, we went 5 minutes late to start, so we have a few minutes.
Okay. Well, it was just, Will, you were talking about something that reminded me how we can really miss the mark sometimes and expect that everybody would do well with an outdoor adventure. And we were recruiting, we got National Parks in Canada gave us a large purse of money to provide outdoor programming for what they called new Canadians, so all the immigrant populations. And we were able to recruit through Boys and Girls clubhouses, and there was all these young people, lots of immigrants. And we sold the idea of an outward bound week-long expedition. And one youth in front of us had said, so you want me to put all of my belongings in a bag and carry them on my back through the wilderness and sleep under a tarp and cook food over a fire? That's what we did getting out of Somalia for weeks. And it was the most traumatic experience of our lives. So a Somalian refugee had lived this experience that we call outdoor adventure. And this was our program that we were marketing to them, and we missed the mark so poorly. What we ended up providing was cabin experiences and nature walks. Because we were thinking again that this is what young people need and this will be good for them. And it was a complete misfit. And so when people are programmed or put into programs, that didn't start with a needs assessment, that didn't start with client preference, that didn't start with anything other than our beliefs, which are often misguided. So
yeah, absolutely. I have a similar experience. I was working at I had a youth drop-in center with new arrivals. That was the terminology we were using here in Adelaide. And so every day after school, young people, Somalia, Syria, Sudan, they'd come in and we play pool and play FIFA on the Xbox, and it was so fun. And we had a tiny bit of funding. So I got Kylie and from Operation Flinders, because they had a big bus, and we took all the young people kayaking. And I don't think one kid got in a kayak. And because they were never taught to swim, so we just bobbed around in life vests for 2 hours in a muddy estuary and had so much fun. And the guy who brought loaded up all his kayaks, he was in such a bad mood. He's like, this is a waste of my time. Why am I here? I should be teaching them paddle skills, this and that. And we had so much fun just bobbing around. And for those in South Australia, Ben will know this as well, and we'll pass to Graham to end this, that Garden Island is it's mangroves and it's a dolphin estuary. So dolphins come around in like less than 3 feet of water. It's incredible. So you can just be paddling along, dolphins cruising around in shallow water. There's old shipwrecks. It's like really exciting to play there. And so for these kids, what they wanted was not to go kayaking, but to just play in the water. It was really nice. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right, Nevin, that culturally we can totally miss the mark sometimes. And one thing with that all Indigenous women's trip, the welcome to country provided by the elder fell through. So there was no welcome to this new country for these young Indigenous women. And so it was something we probably should have stopped right away, because now we're talking about spirits following us and we're not welcome here. And I was like, I assure you, you are welcomed here. It was just a scheduling, and it made for a really horrible first few days. Okay, with time on hand, Graham.
Yeah, thanks. Look, the idea that I think most people are doing this work because they've really got skin in the game. Like, they've got big heart and they want the best for the young people. And we've got these programs that we think are really great. But to just assume that because we think our program is great, we can then say that we're complying with human rights, you can't do that. You've actually got to look at, like I said, there's 30 articles roughly per convention, and there's 3 conventions that apply to the work I do. So there's like 90 different articles I need to look at and audit our program against before we can really say conclusively that we are, following a human rights-based practice. So our organisation hasn't quite do that, but we're very conscious of human rights, and we're looking at doing this audit later on. So what we've done, and my encouragement to adventure therapy organisations worldwide, is to adopt human rights as a minimum standard of practice. And to do that, we really do need to do the audit, but I'm appreciative of the fact that that's a time-consuming thing, and probably best done by getting our past participants to be involved in that assessment rather than us doing it on ourselves. But that's logistically really difficult, particularly for small organisations. At very least, I think we should be declaring our intention to adhere to human rights and allowing people to then give us feedback on whether or not that's happening. I think that's just being transparent, and also giving the ability for people to seek reparations, not necessarily money, but to seek some redress of things that they might have experienced with us, which may not comply with human rights, at least in their view. And I think that engagement is probably important. So what we've done at our organisation, this is not an advertisement for us, but we've got here a screenshot of what's on our website, on our landing page. And it just declares in that second paragraph that our intention of meeting the rights of those 3 conventions. And then that little square under it says human rights feedback email. So you can click on that and tell us whether or not what you think of our performance against that mark. Later, when we do an audit, then we'll probably maybe use a term like we are a human rights-based organisation, but we've got to go through the process of doing that. So my encouragement to organisations and practitioners worldwide is to separate ourselves from inhumane practice or human rights reducing practice by at least looking at the human rights that apply to our organisation, our practice, and then telling people that that's where we're going, that's what we're trying to achieve, and giving people the opportunity to respond to that. I think that's the very minimum of what we can do, and that will help us to move in the right direction and separate ourselves from organisations that generally you might think are not quite adventure therapy. And I'm thinking of not far down the road from my place, there's a boot camp organisation which is yelling at kids, and there's all sorts of very coercive practice going on. They probably don't even think of themselves as adventure therapy, but they get lumped by the public into the same category as us. And I think this acknowledging the human rights that pertain to us, declaring them to the public, helps to separate ourselves from those practices where that's not what they're interested in doing. So it's a call I'm making internationally, and I started that call at the international conference in June And what's more, I've written a white paper, which Will's having a little bit of a look at it to make sure I'm not getting too carried away. But I've written a white paper of why I think this is important, how we can go about as organisations doing this, and then in the appendices showing what are the articles in the 3 main conventions that we use, so that organisations can have a look at it and start calculating what is the cost benefit of going through the audit for these 90 different articles, and how in giving it some context. So that white paper will be finishing off and publishing. Where will that go, Will, so people can get hold of it?
Yeah, we'll just email it out with all the resources to everybody as well, if it's of interest. And that comes with a bunch of other stuff too. With that, I have an hour break. Rachel is giving cred to one of your trainings, Graham. That's fantastic.
Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah, that is great. Thanks for sharing that, Rachel. That is fantastic. So I have about a 50-minute break, and then we have Doug's closing presentation. If any of you have registered for that. If not, thank you for joining and interacting with us and having a chat. It's always really nice. And thank you, Graham, for presenting this as part of the series. And I hope you all have a great day. Nevin, it's probably nearly dinner time. And yeah. All right, team. Thanks so much. And always feel free to get in touch if you have questions or anything like that. And let's keep working.
Right. Good job, you guys.
See you,
Thanks,
dude.
everyone.
See you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.